welcome our Auditor General, Ms. Cora, her staff, and her guest. And Ms. Cora, please proceed.
Marcy Cora, Auditor General, and we have representatives from Parks Division with us, if they could join us at the table. And I'll have staff and representatives introduce themselves.
Will Hamner, Audit Manager.
Erica Jones, Principal Senior Auditor.
Mindy Hayner, Audit Manager.
Alicia Bradford, Department of Public Service, Parks Division Director.
Welcome.
Thank you.
What do you have before you today? This is our corrective action plan that was submitted from the Department of Public Services Parks Division for the Parks Millage Distribution Process Performance Audit Report. I'm going to turn over to Will Hamner and Erica Jones, and they'll go through the presentation.
Good morning. As Marcy indicated, in accordance with generally accepted government auditing standards, we requested a corrective action plan from the Department of Public Services Parks Division to address the recommendations that we identified in our park millage distribution process report. It was a performance engagement. The report was dated October 11th, 2021. The objectives for that particular report was to assess compliance to rules and regulations, state laws, ordinances, as well as to assess the allocation and distribution of park millage funds to communities for approved capital projects. Based on the corrective action plan submitted by the Parks Division, there were 12 recommendations in total, and we assessed all 12 and noted that all 12 were implemented by management within the corrective action plan, and we applaud them for that. With that being said, Erica, I'll go through the presentation and just an overview of the CAP.
Yes, our first recommendation was to ensure that timely communications are held with the communities to obtain reimbursement requests as mandated in the intergovernmental agreement. This recommendation was implemented. We determined that Parks Management implemented a policy that addresses the timing to conduct status update communications with local communities prior to the expiration date of the IGA. We also saw that the policy requires for parks to remit a status update notification to the local community within 9, 6, and 3 months of the IGA's expiration date. Again, based on a limited review of the action taken, management appeared to have taken sufficient action to address the recommendation. Our next recommendation was to ensure that the authorization, recording, payment, and review functions are properly segregated and performed by separate staff persons for each reimbursement request. We reviewed the process and procedures for the reimbursement review and determined that the procedures enforce the segregation of duties between the authorization, recording, payment, and review functions that are performed by the DPS staff over reimbursement requests and payment entries in J.D. Edwards. We saw that this recommendation had been implemented as well and that management took sufficient action. The next recommendation was to ensure that a subsequent detailed review of reimbursement documentation is performed and documented to validate that bill invoices are complete and accurate prior to payment processing. We determined that Parks Management implemented these procedures that requires Parks Management to conduct a subsequent review of the reimbursement documentation and to complete a checklist prior to remitting payments to the local communities. This recommendation was implemented and we saw that management took sufficient action. Our next recommendation was to establish and modify current business practices and written procedures to enhance the monitoring over the submission of parks project documentation, reimbursement requests, and follow-up communications to local communities prior to forfeiting funds. And then also to ensure that all Parks Division personnel adequately retain all emails and documentation that is provided by the communities at a minimum during the IGA period for accountability and third-party review. In our assessment, we looked at the Parks millage allocation procedures for communities that states that communities will be given an initial deadline to submit their documentation within 60 days of annual notification. We also saw that if the communities don't respond within 60 days, Parks will send a follow-up email and provide the community a 30-day extension. And if not, if a response is not provided, then funding may be allocated to another community. We also noted that the procedures for community and commission communications requires for Parks Management to archive all email communications with the local communities and the commission, and to track the correspondences within a quarterly tracking spreadsheet for record keeping. We saw that management fully implemented our recommendation and also satisfied this recommendation. Next, we had another recommendation that stated that to ensure that Parks Division personnel record the rationale when Parks millage funds are forfeited in accordance with ordinance and policy. During our review, we looked at the report on commission, district community, expired, unallocated. It's a long day, I'm sorry. And we saw that Parks forfeited fundings from Sumter Township, the city of Taylor, and the city of Livonia. And then we also looked at the email correspondences between Parks and the 3 local localities and determined that the Parks Division effectively documented its rationale and justification for the forfeiture of funds. Based upon a limited review, we determined that management took sufficient action on this recommendation. Next, we had a recommendation to revise and update written procedures to identify acceptable documentation to validate property ownership. We reviewed the Parks millage allocation procedures for communities and determined that the procedure addresses the acceptable documentation to validate property ownership, such as the recorded deed, assignment, leases, and land contracts. We also noted that management fully implemented and satisfied that recommendation. Then we also recommended for Parks Management to revise and update written procedures, documenting and improving the reviews that are performed over Parks project documentation submissions. Parks Division provided us a procedure for the community park. I'm sorry. Parks provided us the community parks millage checklist that required documentation such as project descriptions, property deeds, and budget estimates that are to be submitted and reviewed by Parks Division officials. We reviewed the checklist that Parks utilized for Plymouth Township Park and found that Parks Management signed off on the checklist documenting their review of the project documentation. We also noted that this recommendation was fully implemented and satisfied. Then we also requested for Parks Management to ensure that all correspondence, including follow-ups, are documented and retained by Parks Project. Parks Division has a policy that requires for Parks Management to archive all email communications that are received from the local communities and the Commission Board. We reviewed the email correspondences that Parks received from the City of Trenton and Garden City during fiscal year 22 and determined that management adequately retained the correspondences that were held with the local communities. Based upon our review, we saw that management took sufficient action and that the recommendation was fully implemented.
Go ahead,
Madam
Will.
Chair, yeah, if I may, I'll just conclude the summary. In regards to recommendation 2019-4A, We recommended that the Parks Division revise written procedures to align the current business practices that management and staff utilize when sending out the annual notification letters to the local communities. We reviewed the parks millage allocation for communities procedure and policy, which was revised March 2021, and determined that the policy addresses the target deadline for parks to remit the annual notification letters to the local communities. According to the policy, annual notification letters of allocation should be remitted to the Recreation Department or designated agency no later than December 1st. And a follow-up notification will be sent within 60 days if the community has not responded. Based on the recommendation and the actions implemented, management sufficiently addressed the recommendation. For recommendation 2019-4B, we recommended that they establish procedures to track and document parks, projects, communications held with commission staff, including written letters and electronic mail related to the approval of the park millage allocation letters that were to be sent to the local communities. We noted that the Parks Division management established a communication log to track the commission's approval of the park millage allocation letters. Based on a limited review of those actions taken, it appears they have taken sufficient action to address the recommendation. And the last recommendation we recommended was to retain all communications, including written letters and electronic mail held with the communities regarding the status update on park projects prior to the termination of the intergovernmental agreement. We requested email communications regarding the status of projects for 7 communities in 2021. Those communities were Van Born Township, Canton, Southgate, Detroit, Redford, Taylor, and Sumter Township. Parks Division management was able to provide the email communications for all 7 communities without exception. And again, based on our limited review, management appears to have taken sufficient action to address the recommendation. Based on the actions taken, a follow-up will not be needed for this particular engagement because management has implemented all the 12 of the recommendations. And again, I applaud Mrs. Bradford for working with us cooperatively.
And can I applaud her also?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And seriously, thank you for doing a great job.
Thank you.
And so, Commissioner Kling.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Hamner, on that very last recommendation you have, 2019-4C, and you point to 7 communities. Did you have a specific reason to pick those 7, or is that just sampling? Sampling. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hamner.
Okay, any further questions or comments from commissioners? Okay, can I get a motion to, I'm sorry. Well, I can do that, to receive and file item 1.
Move to receive and file item number 1.
Okay, it's been moved and supported. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Ayes have it. Next item, Madam Clerk, we'll go to, or I'm sorry, Ms. Cora, just talk about item 2.
We have representatives from the sheriff's office. If they could join us at the table. While we're waiting for them to come to the table. This is our corrective action plan for the sheriff's jail and our auditor general's assessment for this jail inmate property performance audit report. We worked quite lengthily with the sheriff's office too, so that we could get the recommendation to a point where they're either in process or implemented. So I'm going to have staff introduce themselves and we'll have the sheriffs introduce themselves also. There is a lot, there's.
Can I get some order here? Thank you. Please proceed.
Just for the presentation purposes, there's 28 recommendations, but we're only going to discuss the ones that are in process because there's so many of them. Tim, if you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, I work for the Auditor General and Tim Small.
If representatives from the sheriff's office can introduce themselves for the record.
Good morning, Benita Terry, Director of Administration, Sheriff's Office.
Jackie Safransky, Finance Administrator, Sheriff's Office.
Welcome. Please proceed.
Just to give a quick summary of the original engagement that we presented in December of 2021 on jail inmate property. Our objective on the original engagement was to assess the control environment, the effectiveness of operations and compliance with policies, procedures, laws, and regulations governing inmate property. We identified on that audit 28 recommendations, as Marcy previously stated. And of those, 23 were implemented, 5 were in process, and I'm going to hand it over to Tim to discuss the 5 that are in process.
Yeah, so I'll run through those 5. So 35A was immediate action should be taken to eliminate or greatly reduce instances in which numerical check sequence gaps are created as a result of not saving withdrawal transactions in the jail management system. And 37, since it's linked with 35A, work with JMS vendor to modify the system to prevent manipulation of the check number field. So during our initial performance audit, it was unclear why a significant number of gaps in numerical check sequence were identified and why duplicate check numbers and voided checks cleared the bank. These issues were primarily due to the check printer's ability to manually override the check number field in JMS. Several years ago, the Wayne County Sheriff's Office put in a request to Tyler Technologies to lock down the check number field. Resolution was expected in 2020. However, due to COVID, the upgrades were postponed. The JMS upgrades were rescheduled and began in mid-February of this year. These upgrades will lock down the check number field to disallow any manual overrides. If the planned action is implemented as described, the action appears to sufficiently address the recommendations. However, a follow-up review may be necessary in the near future to verify that described action has actually occurred. The next one, 4A, Wayne County Sheriff's Office Finance should initiate a formal transition plan with Wayne County Treasury Office to prevent monthly bank reconciliation activity from falling behind. So our discussions with the Finance Office indicated formal transition plan has not been initiated with the Treasury Office. According to Wayne County Sheriff's Office Finance, the Treasury Office is in the process of implementing software upgrades to their systems. Although discussions to transition the bank reconciliation activity have not taken place, Sheriff's Office intends to do so in the near future. So we encourage this transition be completed as soon as possible, as performance of the monthly bank reconciliation is a critical control to identify errors and discrepancies. If this planned action is implemented as described, the action appears to sufficiently address the recommendation. However, a follow-up review may be necessary in the near future to verify that the action has actually occurred. So next one, 4C, reconciliations should reconcile bank activity per the bank statement to cash balances in the jail management system. So Wayne County Sheriff Finance is in the process of revising the bank reconciliation process to account for all transactions and inmate activity flowing through all modules in JMS. Revisions are in the early stages, with the first step taken to identify old uncashed checks eligible for escheatment to the state of Michigan. Follow-up review may be necessary in the near future to assess whether reconciliation procedures are appropriately designed and working as intended. If the planned action is implemented as described, the action appears to sufficiently address the recommendation. However, follow-up review may be necessary to verify that described action has actually occurred. So the last one in process, 5A, Wayne County Sheriff Office Finance should develop policies and procedures to handle unclaimed inmate property in accordance with the Michigan Uniform Unclaimed Property Act. So the Finance Office indicated they are awaiting the county to prepare and issue a formal policy for handling unclaimed property before determining amounts requiring escheatment. We agree it is the county's responsibility to issue a formal policy with regards to escheating funds to the state of Michigan. Regardless of whether a countywide policy exists, Wayne County Sheriff's Office Finance has performed an analysis of all outstanding checks to determine an amount escheatable to the state of Michigan. Furthermore, the Finance Office is in process of developing procedures to periodically assess long outstanding checks for achievement to the state. So once these procedures are developed as described, the action appears to sufficiently address the recommendation. However, a follow-up review may be necessary in the near future to verify that the described action has actually occurred. So those are the five in process ones.
Thank you. Ms. Cora?
And as I indicated earlier, there was 28 recommendations. So the sheriff's office, along with working with the audit team, Ms. Safransky, Ms. Terry should be commended for the work they've done to get the 23 recommendations implemented. There's just 5 recommendations still in process. So hopefully by the time we do a follow-up, they'll be implemented also.
I'd like to thank the audit staff and also the sheriff's department for working together and moving us right along. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So any comments? Commissioner Dodd.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's great to hear that there's been so much progress on this, on the performance report. Do you have any idea when we might expect these last 5 to be completed?
The 2 that are waiting for the vendor to resolve, we have no idea when they're going to get to that. I think what they're trying to do is bill us more outside of our contract. I think that struggle is going on, but that's being handled by our IT staff.
Okay.
The item with the treasurer's office is probably going to be resolved this summer, because I think they'll be at a point where they can talk to us when their schedules are not so jammed up. The achievement items, from our standpoint, we have everything ready to go to the state. Everything's been identified, and we're just waiting for the county to come out with that policy, because we're not going to do something on our own and run counter to what the county wants to have done.
Ms. Cora?
And that was an
sorry.
item we discussed at the single audit finding meeting we had at the last committee on audit, and the county's in the process of working with Corporation Council to implement the policy for achievement.
Okay, right.
Excuse me, in regard to our system upgrade, we are actually scheduled to go live with that upgrade August 15th. And hopefully at that time, it will make corrections to all the issues that's identified here.
Right. And then, Ms. Cora, will we have another meeting to go over these last 5 items when
Yeah.
they're finally implemented?
Right. As part of our process in the office, we start out with our performance report. We do our corrective action plan. And if there's any outstanding recommendations still in process, we will do a follow-up review of those recommendations, but we'll wait until the sheriff's office had a chance to implement the further action.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Any further
Thank you, Mr.
questions? Commissioner Kleen?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On those, on the very last one, it's referred to in here as unclaimed inmate property. How does that situation arise, right? I'm thinking, okay, I've seen the movies, right? You come out of jail, they hand you your envelope and whatever else that they took from you when you went in, and you get on your way. How do we wind up with unclaimed inmate property? And is that cash?
There are many times when the inmates are going to another facility and their personal property does not go with them.
Hmm.
In September of 2020, we started using debit cards for inmates who were getting released. And pretty much it was for anyone going to another agency or facility, we would still mail a check to that facility. If you were getting released, total final released out to the street, you would get your remaining funds on a debit card. Some people don't want to wait for their debit card. They've got $3 or $4 left in their account. They don't want to wait for it. Previously, everybody was issued a check. So if you were getting released out to the street and you had 32 cents in your account, you'd get a check for 32 cents. And many people have the opinion of, one, I'm not going to wait for you to cut me a 32-cent check. Or I'll take the 32-cent check, but I'm never going to bother getting it cashed, because many of these people are in the population where they don't use a bank. And to go to a liquor store or a party store and cash a 32-cent check, they'll be out $4 to get 32 cents.
Right.
So we have had a lot of checks that are $5 or less. I would say it probably makes up 65% of our total outstanding checks that should be as cheated. And the primary reason is because they don't want to wait for a check, or they don't want to bother cashing a small check.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
If I could add to, Jackie, how far back do you think some of these checks goes? At least maybe 20 years?
From what we had seen, what the treasurer had been keeping before we took it over, they went back to the 1990s.
This is just a thought, but could the sheriffs like keep a like $500 in a cash account where they could just pay them if they're under a certain amount, rather than write a check or do a debit card, just give them the money and say, get out of here? Is that possible?
Possible, but not probable.
Okay.
I don't think M&B accounting, financial reporting, who oversees all the petty cash accounts in the county, would be inclined to open up a new account for that, particularly when we already have a bank account, which is an imprest account, trust account for all the inmate money. This would be another account that we'd be establishing to handle inmate money.
But rather than open up a new account, couldn't they keep, $100 or something like that, where they could just eliminate the process of coming in front of an audit committee and you got 7-year-old checks that hadn't been cashed and they're like 37 cents or whatever? I mean, there's got to be a way of resolving this, and I'll leave it to the bright minds in the sheriff's department.
Well, our resolution, which is part of what we're doing with our achievement, is any checks that are over 1 year old, we're telling the bank that they're going to void. We are not going to maintain checks that are over a year old.
Good.
So if someone's got a check and they haven't cashed it, they got a year to get it cashed.
Oh, good. Thank you. That helps.
But however, since we made, like I had said, the last time we met, we've made a lot of changes that have strengthened our processes. One of those is we don't hand off checks to inmates who are going to other facilities. We don't hand off checks to transport drivers who are taking inmates to other facilities. We send those checks directly to the facility, and we know the staff at those facilities are cashing those checks and putting that money in the inmate account. So it's sitting waiting for them when they get there. And we have seen a significant reduction in outstanding checks since we made this change and moved to debit cards.
I appreciate that. So seriously. Anything further, Ms. Clark?
That's all we have.
Okay, any further questions from commissioners or
Move to receive and file this item, Mr. Chair.
been moved? Can I get support?
Support.
Been moved and supported. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Ayes have it. Next item, Madam Clerk.
F, such other matters as may be properly submitted before the committee.
I don't think there is any. Next item.
G, public comments.
Is there anybody from the public that would like to comment? Anybody from the public that would like to comment second time? Is there anybody from the public who would like to comment the third and final time? Next item, Madam Clerk,
Adjournment.
can I get a motion?
Adjourn.
Can I get support? Any further discussion? All those in favor? All those opposed? Ayes have it.